It never seems real until you look in the mirror. You know, I've always heard that it's not all about the money. The last I checked, a paycheck couldn't buy you all the success and happiness. When Mr. Badass walks into class and slams the door, without saying good morning, I turn and ask him for his pass. And in a blink of an eye, he snaps and says three words, but all I really hear is, fuck, get it, miss? You don't know me, and I don't know you. So don't act like you can see through me when I can't even see through you. Real recognizes real, and the only real I see is you giving up on me. Never had I intended to discourage this young man. In all actuality, I think I do the best that I can. But is my best really good enough, or is my capacity on E? How quickly we, spelled with an I, can forget how much impact I can really have. When I'm feeling broken and looking for spiritual guidance, I go to my pastor. When I'm feeling professionally drained with the profession that's in my veins, I go to my mentor. And when Mr. Badass is crying out for help because he's angry with his home life, frustrated with his disability, disengaged from my humanity because he appears to be a troubled child, I turn him to the door believing there is nothing I can do to help him anymore. And then I hear him say, real recognizes real. And the only real I see is you giving up on me. So I take a look in the mirror and I ask myself, is this young man's future worth my paycheck? Or is it worth so much more?
So yeah, we just coming back from that poem. What was that piece called again?
Raw Confessions.
Raw Confessions. And so I felt like me kind of explicating that poem or picking it apart, reflecting on it, vibing with it. I really feel that it was a raw confession, and that it was very vulnerable. And you correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the poet, and now I get to sit here and kind of like pick it apart with the poet. But this is a poem that's written from the perspective of an educator, correct?
Yes.
And one of the things that really stood out to me in the piece is the idea of perspective and how it's attached to how the student is perceived. Some of the language that like stuck out was Mr. Badass. So Mr. Badass like right away jumps out to me as like I'm making a claim as to what the student is. I'm already labeling that they're a badass because the other character in the poem is the student, right?
Right.
And so I'm thinking about how that perception of him being Mr. Badass sat with the teacher that was in the poem. And then I'm also interested in the student's perspective and how that informs the perspective of the teacher. So talk to us about that.
I had become so indoctrinated into this system. I came right out of teacher school.
Right,
yeah. And into like a regimen of like rules and expectations where I had to do things a certain way. There was expectation that I, as an educator, was to do things a certain way.
And you were made to feel that way.
And I was made to feel that way. I was made to feel like I had to police my students, which prevented me from actually getting to know my students.
Okay.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
So when I talk about, Mr. Badass walks in, and I'm gonna pause you there and think about like who's Mr. Badass that I'm talking about, right?
Right.
Because stereotypically, when people think of a badass, they think of someone who's often causing troubles. And if you look at our discipline data, right, the data tells us that predominantly Black and Latinx males are the ones at the highest of that chart.
Yeah.
So when you're in school and you're talking about Mr. Badass, you're imagining a particular image.
Right.
So as a new educator, reflecting on my experiences in this system that I don't even really fully believe in, right? It was really hard for me to kind of get with the profession because I felt like I really couldn't connect, because it was really important for me to connect with my students. But I also felt like because of the expectations of myself or that the school had of me as an educator,
certain standards,
curriculum
pacings,
et cetera, I was not able to fully invest and take time to get to know my students, but instead I was policing my students, and that was my earlier on experiences. But I saw that my year 1, my year 2, and all the years afterwards that I was in the classroom teaching and working with other educators.
even in those moments where a student walks into a classroom late, and the teacher immediately jumps to conclusions about that student and questions them as to why they're late, as if that were to make them any earlier,
Without
or
saying good morning.
without even saying, without even the greeting, without even the human connection.
And that sets a tone, right? So yes, you're late. Yes, we need to have expectations for students, right? But when a student walks into class and the first thing that I say is, where's your pass? That is setting a tone. That is creating this disconnect and this barrier.
And if you're setting that tone and you're creating that barrier, I'm assuming that barrier blocks that path of connection that is necessary for you to make with the student, or the ability for you to even get to know that student on a real human level.
Right.
Past your preconceived notions, past your biases, but to truly get to know that student. And so that's a perfect segue into a gift that I think that you plan on providing, and I'll chime in wherever it helps. But you have some strategies you have like a Amaka methodology for truly getting to know your students.
Right.
Some key things that you would point out to other educators that they could actually use and apply and actualize in their teaching and learning spaces.
Right.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump into that right now.
So one of the gems that's essential to getting to know students, truly getting to know students, is giving them choice and watching what they gravitate to. But one thing that we want to be mindful of is not giving a this or that option, because that's very limiting. Oftentimes, educators will provide students with 1, 2, or 3 choices, which also limits, and it assumes that that's something that students are interested in. So we don't want to assume. Another gem that I want to drop for y'all is asking students opinions and giving questionnaires, right? So we do surveys and we give questionnaires as a way to collect information across the masses. When we have a school survey, we want to know about class perspectives or opinions. We tend to give out questionnaires and interest surveys, which could be good as a starter to collect information and data. However, we don't want to just settle with questionnaires and surveys, because we don't want to turn students' voice into data points without context.
Yeah, I would just add to that a little bit. When you talk about opinions, you want to make sure that when you are asking a student for their opinion, that you're not doing it for asker's sake, right? That you literally and intentionally want to get their opinion. You are actually viewing them as a source that will help to truly inform what you're doing as an educator in the space to benefit them.
You have a gem, Parker, that I particularly love and enjoy that you actually put into practice, that I started to use myself. What is that?
Yeah, so I guess this is gem number 3. We just did gem 1 and gem 2. This will be gem number 3. So what you do is you actually build a youth critique squad to critique what it is that you're doing pedagogically in the classroom. And even, not only just pedagogically, even just as a human being and how you're interacting with youth in the space. So one of the things that I know that we would engage in is we would build a squad of students, and at the end of every class, actually I would do mine weekly. So middle of the week, Wednesday and Friday, I would be like, yo, how am I doing? Like, what's good with the lessons? Is it boring? What is it that like I could do to enhance it? What would you like to see? How are the break times? How am I interacting with students? Truly give me your feedback, and I would use that feedback to inform what it was I was doing in the classroom each day.
And although that can be intimidating for any educator, especially new educators or seasoned educators who've been doing this for a long time, it is absolutely necessary to seek consistent and ongoing feedback directly from the primary source, our students.
Absolutely, and it is a segue into being able to come to know your students. It seems like it's kind of like set apart from that, but you are building a certain sense of trust culture. You're culturifying that trust by being consistent, intentional about it, and asking for the feedback of your youth, which helps to break down barriers and allows for pathways for connections to be made.
So gem number 4, actually listening and observing vicariously, right? So oftentimes we say that, oh, we listened to student voice, we heard, we asked questions, but take time to actually listen and observe when students are not necessarily directly in instruction. Listen to them in the hallways. Listen to them during break times. Go into the cafeteria and observe the interactions between them and their friends. And instead of assuming deficit, assuming assume genius, right?
Yes, yes. And I love how you talked about those non-structured times as being the valuable sources of what it is that we gain about students and come to know about students. So I know that we're very intentional about having a break time. The break time in class sometimes is the most powerful pedagogical tool that you could use, where you intentionally building that time and you just float and you just listen. You listen to the authentic conversations. Youth Culture Power, one of the resources that we're referencing, has a whole chapter on classroom chatter. They actually have a whole hip hop song about it, about how important it is to listen to that chatter, what a lot of educators tend to view as being um, excessive noise or an off-task buzz. That's where the richness often is, and we can gain so much knowledge about the youth that we teach through that.
And off that note, I learned more about youth culture listening vicariously to the youth.
Snaps.
Centering and creating spaces for students to amplify their voices is a definite must. We can't give student voices because they already have a voice.
They already have them. They already have them.
We just need to create the space and deconstruct the power that we often try to hold on to as adults and educators in a system that wasn't necessarily built for students with marginalized backgrounds.
Tell the truth. Tell the truth.
And the last gem that I want to drop, which is often assumed to be the most difficult way of amplifying and centering youth voice and truly getting to know your students, is by creating a seat and space for students right next to you in spaces of decision making that directly impact their schooling and lived experiences. So what that means is we have to create spaces for young people at the table next to adults in collaboration with adults, where we are not only picking their brains, but we are utilizing their intellect. We are
Yes.
we are building on their strengths and experiences to inform our decisions where curriculum is concerned. Invite students to PLCs. Invite students to school improvement teams. Invite students to come and organize PBIS. Invite students to come to the table to discuss school discipline policies or even the student handbook.
Yes.
Is it written in student friendly language in a way that students are going to actually want to engage and understand the context?
Invite students on the interview process for teachers being hired.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Centering and creating spaces for students to amplify their voices is a definite must. We can't give student voices because they already have a voice.
They already have them. They already have them.
We just need to create the space and deconstruct the power that we often try to hold on to as adults and educators in a system that wasn't necessarily built for students with marginalized backgrounds.
Tell the truth. Tell the truth. The last gem that I'm gonna drop is what happens is you often get into this trap of thinking that, yo, the first 2 weeks of school, like I'm gonna take this time to build classroom community and get to know my students, and they're gonna get to know me, and then we'll be able to jump into curriculum. When the truth is that you sharing yourself with students need to be ongoing, and you being open to absorbing students sharing themselves needs to be something that's cultified and consistent and ongoing. We evolve as human beings on a daily basis, so we need to keep them updated on who it is that we are, who we're going through. We need to talk about what it is that we've done that's great in life. We also need to share with them our deficits and be vulnerable and model that. And that's another way that you can come to truly get to know your students. Now I know that Amaka, that we will be providing a resource. I know right now you have like the written words up in front of you, and we're kind of speaking to them. But we will have a resource for you that you'll be able to access, I believe, through a link, where you'll be able to get, a little bit more description on what each of these mean and how you might go ahead and apply it and strategies for doing so.